Hey guys, it's Libby, and today, oh boy, it's time for Richard II. But first, before we get to like the good, delicious poetry that is most of this play, we have a lot to talk about. First, scheduling for the Bard Book Club. Okay, so just a reminder, we're working our way through the second tetralogy, starting with Richard II. Next month, it's going to be Henry IV Part 1, then Henry IV Part 2, then Henry V. Then I decided we need to do Merry Wives of Windsor because it's kind of a spin-off of the Henry IV plays. It's basically a fanfic that Shakespeare wrote himself. And then I have decided that after Merry Wives of Windsor, so wait, what month are we in? Okay, so June is going to be Merry Wives of Windsor, and that means July is going to be Measure for Measure, Libby's favorite play. Now, the reason we are doing this is because Amanda Center made a video about how great my taste in books is and how she went and bought a bunch of books inspired by me. And one of those was Measure for Measure. And I was like, hey, you want me to do Measure for Measure next? See, that's all you have to do, guys. You just have to make a video talking about how great I am, and then you can have whatever you want. So I mentioned that this is the first play in the second tetralogy. Shakespeare wrote 2 tetralogies, which are cycles of 4 plays. In this case, both of the tetralogies are history plays. The second tetralogy, it's about to get confusing, hang on. The second tetralogy was written, did I say this was, oh fuck. The second tetralogy was written after the first tetralogy, but the historical events take place after the first tetralogy. And the 2 tetralogies, which the more you say it becomes a harder word to pronounce, sort of go back to back. So we follow pretty smoothly from the reign of Richard II through the various Henrys to Richard III, with usually not more than a decade of time in between each play. Now, Shakespeare chronology isn't certain, but we think that Richard II was written several years before Henry IV, Parts 1 and 2, and Henry V, so it's not clear to what extent Shakespeare was planning to continue this story, but sure, I'm glad he did, because the other plays are, you know, they definitely have some good bits. The second tetralogy is also sometimes called the Major Tetralogy because it is better than the first tetralogy. It is also sometimes called the Henriad for its focus on Henry V. And if you call it the Henriad, you are sort of mentally positioning yourself to treat this play as more of a prologue play, because Henry V is not in this play at all. He gets a brief mention towards the end, but he does not appear in it. So now that we've spent that long talking about the name of this play and the cycle that it is in, we can move on to the names of the characters, which are also a little bit tricky. So people get called a lot of different things, and many characters have many different names. Oops. That was my deodorant falling on the floor. So let's go through the 3, I think, most complicated ones, which are Richard himself, John of Gaunt, and Bolingbroke. Let's talk about the different things that they get called. So all of these characters have first names, Richard, John, Henry. And they all have what we would now call a last name, which is Plantagenet, which they pretty much never get referred to as in this play because like half the characters are Plantagenet, so that wouldn't be very helpful. So in addition to your first name and your family name, characters are often referred to by the place they were born, and this functions more as the last name. So for Henry, it's Bolingbroke. For Richard, it is of Bordeaux, and for John, it is of Gaunt. Little aside here, those of you who know their geography will note that Bordeaux is not in England, it is in France. That's because Richard was born in France. He was the last English king to speak French as his native language. Henry IV, his native language was English, and from 1066 with the invasion of you don't have to call it invasion, let's not talk about that right now, with the coming to the throne of William the Conqueror, all of the English kings had spoken French as their native language and as the language of government. But we are about to change that, which does mean that the scene in which Thomas Mowbray is like, oh, I'm so sad that I'm banished and I will never be able to speak my native language of English again is like, maybe English was his native language, but he also definitely spoke French. He's not being doomed to voiceless silence. Anyway, there is another way in which characters are referred to, and that is by their title, which can be inconvenient because it changes. So in that case, Richard, I don't think this ever happens, but he could be referred to as England. Sometimes when people say England, they mean the King of England. This isn't used more often about when kings are talking about each other, so we'll see this more when we move into plays that involve French kings, kings of France, not kings who were born in France. John of Gaunt is also the Duke of Lancaster, so he is referred to as Lancaster sometimes. And Bolingbroke starts out as his highest title is Duke of Hereford, which in some texts is spelled Hereford, and in some texts is spelled Hereford. And the modern English, is it a province? Is it a county? Is called Herefordshire. But for the meter, it works better if you do the two-syllable Hereford. So I will try to say Duke of Hereford. I'll probably just call him Bolingbroke, though. So he starts out as Duke of Hereford. When his father dies, he becomes the Duke of Lancaster, and then by the end he is England, the King of England, Henry IV. And now I decided it was necessary to do this with this play, and I think it will be necessary to do this with all of the history plays, and that is to talk about what actually happened, what was the story, what was the plot, before we can get on to all of the delicious poetry. I was actually quite fortunate in that my first encounter with Richard II was a stage production in which they took like 4 scenes from a play by somebody else from the approximately correct time period, the 1590s, which were about the Duke of Gloucester and his death, which was affected, shall we say, by Richard II. And they just like glommed that onto the beginning, because at the start of Richard II, for a modern audience, it's like there's 2 guys who are both accusing each other of treason. What is happening? I don't know whose side I'm supposed to be on. Then we get rid of those people, bring on 2 old people who are talking about like how someone is dead, but it's all very confusing. Let's bring back the 2 guys who are accusing each other of treason. Oh no, wait, now they've left the stage. What is happening? So for me, it was good to have a bit of footing, and of course Elizabethan viewers knew this story. It'd be like watching a play about, I don't know, Richard Nixon. No, there weren't any people who were alive to see Richard II and to see the play Richard II. But it's like watching the musical 1776. No one's like, oh, wait, is South Carolina a slave owning state? I can't remember. Or, I wonder if they will actually sign the Declaration of Independence. It's kind of like that. Like you are going to see it for the poetry and the themes, not the plot, because you already know the plot. But since we modern readers and viewers do not, cue Plantagenet family tree. So this is the best iteration of the Plantagenet family tree that I can find. There is one thing I don't really like about it, and that is that Edward III's sons are not in order of birth. By the time we get to the Henry VI plays, it will become very important that the firstborn son was Edward, Prince of Wales, but the secondborn son is Lionel, Duke of Clarence, who is dead by the time Richard II takes place. But his line will come back to haunt us. So after Lionel, we've got John, Duke of Lancaster, who's John of Gaunt in this play. Then we have Edmund, Duke of York, who is the Duke of York in this play, and the father of O'Merle. You'll see here that the Duke of York had 2 sons, Edward and Richard. Shakespeare condensed these down into one because he really liked writing that passage where the Duchess of York is complaining that she only has 1 child, and if her husband lets him die, then she will have no children left. That is not actually true, but is poetically nice. And then we have Thomas, Duke of Gloucester, who is also dead. at the beginning of Richard II. And also note that Edward, Prince of Wales, died before his father, Edward III, so the crown skipped a generation, and Richard II got the throne from his grandfather when he was only 9 years old. And being so young, this may have had like a not great effect on his socialization. So let's start, she said, as though we were not 10 minutes in already, with a dry, technical, but nonetheless necessary synopsis of the events of this play. So first we have Mowbray and Bolingbroke trying to fight each other. Bolingbroke is accusing Mowbray of generally bad things, but one specifically bad thing, and that is arranging for the murder of the Duke of Gloucester at Calais. He is somewhat pointedly doing this because it is a semi-open secret that Richard himself ordered the murder of his uncle, the Duke of Gloucester. And so he's like, yeah, Mowbray killed Gloucester. You gonna say that he didn't? And Mowbray is attempting to defend himself. The king wants them to solve this peacefully, but they will not. So he says, okay, you can have a sort of chivalric joust or a sword feat contest thing later, so that we can have a quick little scene featuring the Duchess of Gloucester, the widowed Duchess of Gloucester, and her brother-in-law, John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, in which they basically say, yeah, Richard killed the Duke of Gloucester, but he's the king. He's anointed by God. What are we mere mortals gonna do? Nothing. And then the Duchess of Gloucester goes off stage, and next time we hear from her, she's dead. Then we move to the field where Mowbray and Bolingbroke are going to fight. They are about to stab each other when Richard throws his warder down, which stops the battle, and he decides instead to banish them, Mowbray for life, and Bolingbroke first for 10 years, but then, since he doesn't want to make his uncle sad, he changes it to 6 years. These two men both leave. Then Richard is hanging out with his friends, Bushy, Bagot, and Green, living the good life. I imagine, like, lounging on divans, eating honeyed sweets. And then Richard kind of wants to go fight some wars in Ireland, but doesn't really have any money because he spent all of his money on divans and honeyed sweets. But then he hears that his uncle Gaunt is sick, and he's like, sweet, let's go see if he'll just hurry up and die. So he goes, and Gaunt does oblige. He hurries up and dies, and his land and all of his stuff is supposed to go to his son, but his son is not here to take it right now, which means Richard can spend it on Irish wars. Let's go to Hibernia. And then Richard is gone, and Bolingbroke finds out about this, and he's like, oi, that's my stuff. So he comes back. Northumberland and some of his colleagues witnessed the seizure of the Duke of Lancaster's goods, and he's like, oh, that's not so great. Maybe this is our chance to get rid of the king. So they go and meet Bolingbroke and are like, hey, you want some help taking over the kingdom? I mean, taking back your stuff? And he's like, I do, yes, thank you. So then they go. The Duke of York, who is the uncle of Richard II, father of O'Merle, the only one of the sons of Edward III who is left, he is ruling as regent while Richard is in Ireland, and he's like, hey, stop. You can't just march soldiers across England, especially when you've been banished. And Bolingbroke is like, I'm just here to take the stuff that was stolen unjustly from me, and also I have a bunch of soldiers right behind me. What you think, uncle? And the Duke of York is like, okay, I guess this is fine. I shall stand as neuter. Then various armies go over. They either disband or they go over to Bolingbroke's side. So by the time Richard comes back, he does not have anyone to fight for him. And then he's like, oh, darn. So he consents to abdicates in favor of his cousin. Bolingbroke never like directly asks, at least in this play, never directly demands the throne. He keeps saying, I'm just here for the goods that belong to the Duke of Lancaster, which is now me. But Northumberland, who is, you know, the most easily identifiable bad guy in this play, is like, nah, Richard, you gotta step down. You gotta let your cousin be king. So Richard steps down, he lets his cousin be king, and it's like one of the greatest scenes ever written. And then Richard is taken to Pomfret Castle, as it's called in this play. It's normally called Pontefract Castle, but that is just really not good for poetry. His wife is sent back to France. Richard, the historical Richard, his wife at this time was Anne of Bohemia, not a French princess, but his first wife was French, and we're kind of, you know, massaging the characters and merging them when it is convenient. So she goes back to France. Richard is hanging out in Pomfret Castle. Henry, now Henry IV, gets rid of the rest of the people who were opposing his reign by beheading them. And then a guy who appears just to do this, Exton, goes, murders Richard, and then brings his body back to Henry, and he's like, hey, happy times. And Henry's like, no, this is not happy times. This is sad times. And scene. I hope that was clear. I hope I didn't mix up anybody's names and accidentally call Henry Richard at some point. I feel like maybe I did that. If you are confused about anything, feel free to ask me questions in the comments, or Wikipedia also exists and will tell you all of these things. So now let's get down into some slightly juicier stuff and talk about the brand spanking new theatrical genre of history that was just coming into vogue at the end of the 16th century, or not even vogue, existence. So before this, plays, like, Shakespeare is really at the beginning of a new approach to theater. Previously, most plays had been religious and non-professional. But kings and lords sort of got tired of this, and in England they passed a law saying that you can't just be like a vagabond actor wandering from town to town putting on random plays. You need to, they basically said you can't be an actor. But what acting guilds did was attach themselves to a nobleman and claim that they were his servants, and you know, one of the things they did as his servants was entertain him, even if perhaps he is not there. We'll just have some other people come in and, you know, they have to pay, but we're really performing for our liege, and that's why it's fine. So most plays before this had been biblical, but now getting into more secular works, and in fact, for Shakespeare and his contemporaries, they very rarely touch on biblical subjects. Certainly not directly, although you do get some indirectness. If you're interested in that, take a look at Marlowe's play Dr. Faustus, which is about a man who makes a deal with Mephistopheles, who does appear on stage. But even though Richard II is one of these plays that's sort of turning its back on medieval acting styles and playwriting styles and sort of looking more at classical models, specifically Seneca, as well as Plautus and Terence, the three big Roman playwrights. I think there's still some influence from the religious dramas of the past. So there's a lot of, I don't know if you picked up on it, guys, but there's a lot of Christian imagery in this play. And beyond that, there's also an attempt to sort of mythify English history, to tell it as though it were a classical epic or a Bible story. One of the ways we see that is in the verse. Richard II is written entirely in verse, which is unusual for Shakespeare and for playwrights of the time. Even the gardener's assistant gets to speak in verse. And so while in the typical Shakespeare play, you've got prose for lowly talk and verse for elevated talk, and then if it's like a really special moment, you'll go into rhymed verse or couplets. In Richard II, like, blank verse, unrhymed verse, is the standard, and we more frequently go into the uber fancy couplets. If you want more information on this, I did an entire video about Shakespeare and verse, which you can check out, or if you're watching the playlist. She pointed to the right side and said it's in the playlist, the Bar Club playlist. Another way in which Shakespeare ups the epicness of English history in his history plays is through use of prophecy, which appears both in Bible stories and in classical plays. In some cases, they are original to Shakespeare, and in some cases, they are based on Shakespeare's sources, which in this case is often Holinshed, who wrote a history of this time. So some examples, John of Gaunt says to Richard, my brother Gloucester, plain, well-meaning soul, whom fair befall in heaven mongst happy souls, may a precedent and witness good that thou respects not spilling Edward's blood. Blah, blah, blah. Live in thy shame, but die not shame with thee. These words hereafter thy tormentors be. When Bushy asks the queen why she is sad, she responds with, yet again, methinks some unborn sorrow, ripe in fortune's womb, is coming towards me, and my inward soul with nothing trembles. At something it grieves more than with this parting from my lord the king. And then, of course, Bushy goes on to dismiss this, which a woman having a prophetic vision and then her getting dismissed, that's something we've seen before in classical myth. When Salisbury learns that Richard's Welsh soldiers are going to abandon him, he doesn't actually do augury of the skies, but he invokes that sort of imagery by saying, Richard, with the eyes of heavy mind, I see thy glory like a shooting star fall to the base earth from the firmament. Thy sun sets weeping in the lowly west, witnessing storms to come, woe and unrest. Thy friends are fled to wait upon thy foes, and crossly to thy good all fortune goes. The Bishop of Carlisle, one of Richard's last allies, says to various of Richard's enemies, the blood of English shall manure the ground, and further ages groan for this foul act. Peace shall go sleep with Turks and infidels, and in this seat of peace tumultuous wars shall kin with kin and kind with kind confound. Disorder, horror, fear, and mutiny shall here inhabit, and this land be called the field of Golgotha and dead men's skulls. Oh, if you raise this house against this house, it will the woefulest division prove that ever fell upon this cursed earth. Prevent it, resist it, let it not be so, lest child's children cry against you, woe. This is referring directly to, with the benefit of 20/20 vision that playwrights have, to the Wars of the Roses, which will result from the actions taken in this play. That is why you gotta read the 8 plays of the tetralogy in order to fully appreciate them, because Henry V parts 2 and 3 are largely focused on the Wars of the Roses. And then finally, the last prophecy I have is like a really delicious one. Richard gets to deliver it himself to Northumberland. He says, Northumberland, the ladder wherewithal the mounting Bolingbroke ascends my throne, the time shall not be many hours of age more than it is, ere foul sin gathering shall break into corruption. Thou shalt think, though he divide the realm and give thee half, it is too little, helping him to all. He shall think that thou, which knowest the way to plant unrightful kings, wilt know again, being ne'er so little urged, another way to pluck him headlong from the usurped throne. The love of wicked men converts to fear, that fear to hate, and hate turns one or both to worthy danger and deserved death. That is foreshadowing the next 2 plays in this tetralogy, are mainly Henry IV Part 1. We talk about a little in Henry IV Part 2, in which Northumberland and his family do indeed take up arms against Henry IV. Oh wait, sorry, one more. At the very, very end, this one you have to know your Holinshed in order to get it, but Henry IV says, I'll make a voyage to the Holy Land to wash this blood off my guilty hand. He's saying, I'm going to go to Jerusalem, and according to Holinshed, there was a prophecy that Henry IV would die in Jerusalem. So if you know that, you kind of read this as him saying, I am going to leave England forever and to go to my death. Stay tuned to Henry IV Part 2 for how that plays out. It's not what you would expect. Okay, moving on to address some of the explicit biblical imagery. First, we've got England as a paradise. We chiefly get this in John of Gaunt's speech about the sceptered isle, which is now like often quoted out of context about how awesome England is. And at the beginning of the play, at least, we see Richard casting himself sometimes as God, sometimes as Jesus. And he's attempting to cast Bolingbroke as Adam. So he is this like ethereal, celestial, floating thing up on his throne. And he has the power to banish someone from paradise. He banishes Bolingbroke/Adam from England/paradise. Later in the play, in the two scenes when he learns that his allies have abandoned him, and when he is actually giving the crown to Henry, he calls the people who betray him Judas, and the people who stand by while he is betrayed Pilate, clearly casting himself as Jesus. He also is constantly talking about himself as the Son, S-U-N, talking about how, don't you know, O Merle, when the Son, me, is away in Ireland/the Antipodes, / on the other side of the earth, then bad things happen. But as soon as the Son, me, comes back, everything is fine. He likens himself to a glistering phaeton. I don't have to give you all of them. He talks about himself as the Son a lot. And of course, in English, when you are hearing it, Son, S-U-N, and Son, S-O-N, sound the same. So when you're constantly calling yourself the Son, one can also hear the capital S-O-N, the one, the big guy, Jebus. He's also very insistent that he, as king, has been anointed by God, and so he has this, special direct relationship with God. Who else has this special direct relationship with God? It's Jesus. But he only has this special direct relationship with God because he is king, so when he is no longer king, what does that mean? And we see him kind of start to change his tune when he is deposed. So let's go to the great couple of lines, as though there are any couple of lines in this play that are not great, about the bucket. He says this when he and Bolingbroke each have their hand on one side of the crown, and he says, on one side my hand, and on that side thine. Now is this golden crown like a deep well that owes two buckets, filling one another, the emptier ever dancing in the air, the other down, unseen, and full of water. That bucket down and full of tears am I, drinking my griefs, whilst you mount up on high. Now, he himself is probably crying on stage, or at least stage crying, and he's describing himself as full of tears. And which Bible character is full of tears? Mary Magdalene. So here, interestingly, he's identifying subtextually, maybe Shakespeare didn't even intend this, but I'm pulling it out, as Mary Magdalene, and making Bolingbroke Jesus, and he's saying he is mounting up on high. And Jesus kind of went up in two different ways. Once to the heavenly throne, which is great, and probably at least what Richard thinks Bolingbroke thinks is happening, although possibly not what Bolingbroke actually thinks is happening, because the man does not say a lot of things in this scene, and it's very hard to know what he's thinking. But Jesus also mounts up when he is mounted on the cross. So Richard is sort of marrying these ideas of you get to be king now, you get to be on this pseudo-heavenly throne, but it is also like being on a cross. And I mentioned that Henry is silent throughout this whole scene, or he's very quiet throughout this whole scene. Richard's got line after line after line, and Henry's got 5 lines. And at one point, Richard even refers to him as Silent King. And the Silent King from the Bible is, of course, Jesus at his trial, when Pilate is talking and talking and talking and trying to get Jesus to say something, but Jesus is like, no, not going to do it. I'm just going to let you kill me. Okay, now I'd like to look at this play in the way that it describes, I think is the best word, the transition from the medieval world to what we would call the early modern world, but what Shakespeare would call the modern world. Now, this play is taking place around 1399, which means in Italy, we're about to start having the Renaissance, which will then spread into Germany, France, to a certain extent, Iberia. And I would argue not really into Scandinavia, the Slavic countries, or the British Isles. In my view of history, we're getting away from the play now, but that's fine. In my view of history, Scandinavia and the British Isles basically go straight from the Middle Ages to the early modern period, and like Russia goes straight from the Middle Ages to the 19th century, what with its feudalism and all that. So the plays that follow this one chronologically, the Henry IV plays, Henry V, the Henry VI plays, and then Richard III, show us what England had instead of a Renaissance. It had civil war, and it had wars with France in the 100 Years' War. So all of that, from Richard II to the time Shakespeare is writing, or to the century that Shakespeare is writing at least, is a kind of dead time in which like all this great stuff is happening everywhere else, but England, it's just a mess. So this is the closest point we have to a transfer, and then I guess we'll have another one when we go from Richard III to Henry VII, the first Tudor king, of a transition from the medieval period to the early modern period. In this play, of course, in the transition from the king being a religious figure who rules by divine right to the king being a political figure who rules by merit or by right of arms. So when Richard is king, everything is kind of magical, and words have an unusual amount of power. There's a lot more types of speech are speech acts, meaning just by saying a word, it has an effect in the real world. So in Act 1, we have these two knights in shining armor throwing down their gauntlets to each other and challenging each other to jousts for the reputation of the king, which even to Shakespeare's audience would have seemed kind of old-fashioned. You've got Richard, like the sun, sitting there on his glorious throne, able to stop combat by throwing his warder down, and then, everyone has to stop. He is able to render people banished just by speaking it. And of course, to shorten banishments, Bolingbroke says, "How long a time lies in one little word, 4 lagging winters and 4 wanton springs end in a word, such is the breath of kings." And you've also got the Duchess of Gloucester and John of Gaunt lamenting but accepting that they can't do anything to Richard regarding the Duke of Gloucester's death. Gaunt says, "God's is the quarrel, for God's substitute, his deputy anointed in his sight, hath caused his death, which if wrongfully, let heaven revenge, for I may never lift an angry arm against his minister." And then when Henry becomes king, you notice that there's a lot more people around him. Richard has very few people surrounding him. O'Merle is generally with him. Then he's got the Bishop of Carlisle and, of course, his friends Bushy, Bagot, and Green, as well as his wife. And then he'll kind of occasionally talk to his uncles, but he's not really hanging out with them. Whereas Henry, there's a whole list of lords at the front who are hanging out with him. Henry Percy, the Earl of Northumberland, Lord Fitzwater, Sir Piers of Exton, and he's always much less the focal point of any scene he's in. Richard is frequently chewing the scenery, whereas Henry is fading into the background. And that's because if you're no longer ruling by divine right, you have to be ruling with the consent of other people, which means other people now have a more important part to play. Also, of course, the obvious historical change from medieval to early modern is the change from French to English language, which Shakespeare does not make use of here because it would have been hard to do the play partially in French, but you know, you did it in Henry V, Shakespeare. I think it would have been effective here. You've also got kind of a repeat of Act 1, Scenes 1 and 3, when Richard is trying to stop his nobles from fighting. When you get to Act 4, Scene 1, when you get to see Henry try to stop his nobles from fighting. This is the scene where various people are challenging mainly O'Merle to duels because of various things, and they're throwing down gauntlets, and O'Merle like runs out of gauntlets to throw down, and he needs to borrow some from somebody else. And you get a bit of a similar thing happening again in the very last scene when things kind of seem to have gotten out of control. Henry is there on his throne, he gets to be king, and then his nobles bring in all of these heads that they've decapitated from his rivals, finally ending with Exton bringing in Richard's dead body. And you can kind of cast your mind back to the beginning of the play when Bolingbroke was challenging someone on the grounds of murder. He's like, you can't just go around killing people. I challenge this man to a duel. And then while Richard and Mowbray had killed one man, he has killed Oxford, Salisbury, Blunt, Kent, not to mention Bushy and Green from earlier, Brocas, Sir Bennet Seeley, the Abbot of Westminster, the Bishop of Carlisle is being he's losing all of his things, and then one Richard of Bordeaux. And we're left kind of thinking, okay, I mean, Richard wasn't a very good king because he just decided to do whatever he wanted, but is this it? Is this really the modern era? Have we arrived with all of this murder? So that's it for all of the big picture thematic stuff. Now let's go through and just talk about some juicy lines. Warning, this section may consist of me reading a passage and then just saying, wasn't that great? And then moving on. So in Act 1, Scene 3, we've got Gaunt advising Bolingbroke how to deal with his exile by saying, suppose the singing birds musicians, the grass whereon thou treadst, the presents strewed, the flowers fair ladies, and thy steps no more than a delightful measure or dance. And Bolingbroke says, who can hold a fire in his hand by thinking on the frosty Caucasus, or cloy the hungry edge of appetite by bare imagination of a feast, or wallow naked in December snow by thinking on fantastic summer's heat? Oh no, the apprehension of the good gives but the greater feeling to the worse. Basically saying, no, pretending doesn't actually get you anywhere. I can only live in the real world. Richard, of course, almost can't live in the real world. He can only sort of live in this world of fairy tale medieval kings. And then when this is denied him, he lives in the world of his mind. Although it is very interesting at the end that Richard performs basically the only action of the entire play, or the only positive action as opposed to negating action, such as stopping people from fighting, or unmaking himself a king. And that is, at the end, he goes and stabs some people. Okay, then I want to talk about two conversations between Richard and Gaunt that I did talk about like 2.5 years ago in another video I made. I think it was a wrap-up where I talked about Richard II, and I talked about these and that, but it's so good I'm gonna talk about it again. So the first one is in Act 1, Scene 3. And this is, I think, significant because this is the first time we see Richard's absolute heavenly power being limited in some way. And interestingly, it's being limited by John of Gaunt, who is one of these people who actually believes in the divine right of kings. So Gaunt is complaining that even though Richard has shortened the sentence of Bolingbroke, this doesn't actually help him because he will be dead by the time his son returns. Okay, I've been doing this for about 90 minutes, so we will be continuing from a chair, and it's also started to get properly dark outside. So we have the funky lighting, and I will try to keep this quick. Just 3 last things. So that conversation between Gaunt and Richard goes like this, starting with Richard. Why, uncle, thou hast many years to live, but not a minute, king, that thou canst give. Shorten my days thou canst with sullen sorrow, and pluck nights from me, but not lend a morrow. Thou canst help time to furrow me with age, but stop no wrinkle in his pilgrimage. Thy word is current with him for my death, but dead, thy kingdom cannot buy my breath. Thy son is banished upon good advice, whereto thy tongue a party verdict gave. Why at our justice seemst thou then to lour? Things sweet to taste prove in digestion sour. You urged me as a judge, but I had rather you would have bid me argue like a father. So what's going on here is in both the form and the content, Gaunt is implying that Richard doesn't actually have unlimited power, although he is anointed by God. And it's really interesting that this is coming from Gaunt, who is one of these people who believes in the divine right of kings. So in the content, it's pretty clear. He's saying, you can't bring me back to life once I'm dead, which Jesus could do. But also in the form, he starts rhyming, and then Richard drops the rhyme scheme, and then Gaunt rhymes again with Richard's words. So Richard is de-elevating the loftiness or the importance of this scene, and Gaunt saying, no, it is important if you want to make it so I die before I see my son again. And not only am I going to restart the rhyme scheme with my own words, I'm going to use your words to restart the rhyme scheme. So he doesn't rhyme on his own word, he rhymes on Richard's last word. Why at our justice seemst thou then to lour? Things sweet to taste prove in digestion sour. And then another uncle-nephew conversation, this time between Bolingbroke and York, and their first meeting after Bolingbroke returns from exile. He kneels and says, my noble uncle. York says, show me thy humble heart and not thy knee, whose duty is deceivable and false. My gracious uncle, tut tut, grace me no grace, nor uncle me no uncle. I am no traitor's uncle, and that word grace in an ungracious mouth is but profane. Obviously some great wordplay, but also I think it's interesting that he's saying showing the knee is deceivable and false, because normally we think of words as being deceivable and false, whereas actions are real, but here we have an example of an action being false. And then finally a passage which is relevant in terms of other plays Shakespeare was writing at this time. This is from Act 3, Scene 3. Bolingbroke is looking at Richard on the battlements of, which castle is it? One of the castles. He says, see, King Richard doth himself appear, as doth a blushing, discontented sun, from out the fiery portal of the east, when he perceives the envious clouds are bent to dim his glory and to stain the track of his bright passage to the Occident. The context is very different, but the words are not too different from, behold, what light through yonder window breaks, it is the east, and Juliet is the sun. When we get to Romeo and Juliet, you will also see a lot of light and sun imagery, as we saw in this play. But that is all for now. It is nighttime, and I have to make dinner. So I will see you later. Let's have a chat in the comments, because there's a lot to say about this play, and I did not remotely cover all of it. See you later.